The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, and opinions expressed herein, belong to the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of Brigham Young University or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
We the people. We the people. We the people. Why are those words so powerful? Why do they touch our soul? Why not we the states? Why not I the king? Why not we the nobles? Why we the people? Those are the first words of the U.S. Constitution. Why is the Constitution a miracle? Who called it a miracle? Why do we believe that the Constitution is inspired by God? Did the Constitution, and in particular the Pennsylvania Constitution, protect Joseph Smith while he translated the Book of Mormon, received the priesthood of God, and learned to be a prophet? Is every word in the Constitution inspired, or are there inspired principles? How can we, as Latter-day Saints, defend the Constitution? This week, we are going to address those questions and figure those out. And my prayer is that you'll leave this week, these lectures, with a testimony of the divine nature of the Constitution, a testimony that God prepared the United States for the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ, a testimony that God tutored Joseph Smith and taught him to be a prophet of God in this country, and a testimony that we are called, that liberty calls us to be defenders of the Constitution. So just a little bit about me. This is the boring part, and we'll get to the fun part. I am the executive director of the J. Reuben Clark Law Society, which is a nonprofit organization sponsored by BYU Law School. It's of attorneys and law students worldwide, and our organization stands for faith and law. We believe that attorneys need to be attorneys of faith, and that faith will direct your law practice. So I work for the Law Society. I do some consulting with the law firm Kurtz & McConkie. I went to American University Washington College of Law, and I've taught for about 10 years at the Université Paris-Cité, which is a school in Paris, France, and I teach comparative constitutional law there. And we'll talk a little about some of the things I teach. I was born in Louisiana. I was raised in Philadelphia, and just like Nephi, I was born of goodly parents. These are my parents. My dad's from Idaho and my mom's from Louisiana. I'm not sure what that makes me, but this is them when they left on their mission to London, and they left twice, once before COVID and once after COVID. They had to return in the middle. And I'm grateful for goodly parents, and I have a story about my mom. I was living in Washington, D.C., and I traveled home to Philadelphia one weekend, and we went to church. And before church, my mom had put on the room I was staying in a book. And this is the book she had put on my dresser. This is by Ezra Taft Benson. It's called The Constitution, A Heavenly Banner. And so I brought this with me to church, knowing that I was going to church for the right reason to listen, but I brought this just in case. And my mom was in nursery, so I decided to help her out in nursery. And, I got into nursery, and instead of helping her, I just ended up reading the whole book. So I was not very good help. But this book touched my soul. It inspired something within me. It just touched a chord, and I'm hoping I can convey that to you today in this lecture and this week, that you'll feel this same importance and gratitude for our Constitution. Now, this is Jamie Raskin. He is a Democratic senator from Maryland. And this was my constitutional law teacher. And this is the first time when I knew I loved the Constitution and I wanted to defend it. And I wanted to learn everything I could about it. He was an excellent teacher. He is the one that led the impeachment proceedings for President Trump, if you follow the news. And his son, unfortunately, died by suicide a year ago, and it was very, very tragic for him. But just a great man. And even though he and I see differently on some constitutional law issues, we still had a good relationship, and I felt respected in his class. And I think that type of civil discourse we can have. And he even gave me an A- on the exam when I did not take the stance on the exam that probably he would have taken. So I do give him credit for that. And A- is good in law school, all right? I know A's at BYU are what we want, but A- in law school, you got to take it when you get it. All right, last thing about me, and then we'll get into the lecture. This is me in New York City, down at Battery Park. And this is a monument dedicated to a guy, and you can look right here, Jesse DeForrest. Jesse DeForrest. So I'm into genealogy. You may or may not be into genealogy, but I've been trying to figure out the meaning of my name, Forrest, which is my first name. And my parents just said it was a name they thought up, but I think it was more inspired than that. So I've been digging, and I found a line that may go back to Jesse DeForrest. But it's been cut, and there's some questionable relationships that I need to figure out. So that's why I have persistence on there, because I need to persist in figuring this out. But Jesse DeForrest was actually the founder of New York City. And he was from France, and he fled as a French Huguenot, and he went to New York City for religious freedom. So that gives me, for myself, a cause or a purpose to defend religious freedom. So let's get into the agenda, and I'm going to try to move pretty fast here because we have a lot to get through, and I put a lot into this presentation. So I'm going to try to move as fast as I can. We're going to first talk about the divinely inspired Constitution, why we think it's inspired, why it's a miracle. Then we're going to talk about the convention itself in Philadelphia, and then we're going to talk about these constitutional principles that President J. Reuben Clark enunciated, that President Oaks recently told us in General Conference. So we'll talk about those briefly today, but if you really want to know those constitutional principles, you'll come Thursday where we'll go in depth on all of them. So the D&C records that God himself established the Constitution. And again, we're gonna review more statements, but this is the scene. This is the miracle of the Constitution. This is a painting by Howard Chandler Christie of the delegates or the founders in Assembly Hall in Philadelphia. And we'll talk more about this painting as we get in it. So George Washington said, "It appears to me that little short of a miracle that the delegates from so many states, which states you know are also different from each other in their manners, circumstances, and prejudices, should unite in forming a system of national government so little liable to well-founded objections." So I think Washington may have been the first one to call this to call the Constitution a miracle. But others have as well. President Oaks, then Elder Oaks, in his talk in 1992, he entitled The Divinely Inspired Constitution, said it was a miracle that the Constitution could be drafted and ratified. So there we go, again, using the term a miracle. And honestly, there's not anyone more qualified to talk about the Constitution than President Oaks. And he went through these credentials in his last talk, but he was a law clerk to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, 15 years a professor of law, and 3.5 years a justice of the Utah Supreme Court. And next April will mark 40 years he's been an apostle. So to me, that's an authoritative statement. James Madison, the whole of them together formed a task more difficult than can well be conceived by those who are not concerned in the execution of it. Adding to these considerations the natural diversity of human opinions on all new and complicated subjects, it is impossible to consider the degree of concord which ultimately prevailed as less than a miracle. The fact that these 13 states could come together and form a document to govern them was truly extraordinary. Okay, J. Reuben Clark, he graduated from University of Utah, received his law degree from Columbia University, was a U.S. ambassador to Mexico in 1930, and at age 62, became second counselor to President Heber J. Grant and served as counselor under Presidents George Albert Smith and David O. McKay. He was a bit in the law school, and the law society I worked for are both named after him. He said the framers had no direct guide in this work, no historical governmental precedent upon which to rely. As I could see it, it is here the divine inspiration came. It was truly a miracle. All right, and then President Hinckley, he always intended to study at Columbia to get a master's or some type of advanced degree, but the church kept calling and pulling him back, so he never made it. But he accomplished much more than I think we can all agree than a degree at Columbia. But he said both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States were brought forth under the inspiration of God to establish and maintain the freedom of the people of this nation. I said it and believe it is true. There is a miracle in its establishment, and that it cannot be explained any other way. So we'll go back to this scene. And not only was it a miracle, the Constitution, the signing, the coming together, but it was inspired of God. So John Adams said, and he was our second president of the United States, the deliberate union of so great and various of people in such a place is without partiality or prejudice, if not the greatest exertion of human understanding, the greatest single effort of national deliberation that the world has ever seen. Thomas Jefferson, the example, and this was in 1789, the same year as the Constitution, or a few years after the Constitution was signed, the example of changing a constitution by assembling the wise men of the state instead of assembling armies will be worth as much to the world as the former examples we have given them. The Constitution, too, which was the result of our deliberation, is unquestionably the wisest ever yet presented to man. And if you know Thomas Jefferson, a founding father who served as third president of the United States, he actually did not sign the U.S. Constitution. He was on a diplomatic mission in France. And then we have in the Doctrine and Covenants, an affirmation of the importance of our framers and our founders. This is D&C 101, and to give it some context, the church was still in Kirtland, but the saints were moving out to Missouri, and the saints were experiencing persecution in Missouri. They had lost household furniture, clothing, livestock, and other personal properties. This is a really difficult time for the church, and this was a revelation of comfort given to Joseph Smith. And the verse right before the one I'm quoting, God tells Joseph Smith that it's not right for men to be in bondage one to another. And then God says, and for this purpose, so that men are not in bondage one to another, I have established the Constitution of this land. So the Constitution is that protection. And then the D&C says, by the hands of wise men whom I have raised up unto this very purpose. So these men were called, or they were raised up for the purpose of coming together and establishing this Constitution. Joseph Smith himself said, I am the greatest advocate the Constitution of the United States there is on the earth. The Constitution of the United States is a glorious standard. It is founded in the wisdom of God. It is a heavenly banner. Joseph Smith did also say he found a fault with the Constitution, that it was not broad enough to cover all ground. He wished that the Constitution had a provision that every officer of the government who neglected or refused to extend protection guaranteed by the Constitution should be punished. This was a time when Joseph knew the Constitution. He knew how important it was, and he was not seeing it being enforced. And he was seeing the persecution of his people. So obviously, and that really isn't a function of the executive government. And I think that's changed since his time. But at that time, that was very difficult for him to know the importance of these principles and see them not followed. And we'll talk about constitutional interpretation, I think, on Friday. But it's important that we interpret properly the Constitution. And that's how it protects us when we interpret it properly. So Brigham Young, the designers of the Declaration of Independence and the framers of the Constitution, were inspired from on high to do this work. When Brigham Young was asked the question whether the Constitution was perfect, he said this: "No, for if men knew anything, they must know that the Almighty has never yet found a man in mortality that was capable at the first imitation to receive anything in a state of entire perfection. They laid the foundation, and it was for after generations to rear the superstructure upon it." So the framers did their part. Are the next generations doing their part? Are we doing our part? Was Brigham Young's point. Again, J. Reuben Clark, the United States Constitution is a great and treasured part of our religion. Okay, Ezra Taft Benson, President Ezra Taft Benson, who wrote this book on the Constitution. "I reverence the Constitution of the United States as a sacred document. To me, its words are akin to the revelations of God, for God has placed his stamp of approval on the Constitution. I testify that God of heaven selected and sent some of his choicest spirits to lay the foundation of this government as a prologue to the restoration of the gospel and the second coming of our Savior." James E. Faust, "The twin religious clauses of the Bill of Rights are golden threads which in the past have permitted those who believe in God to publicly affirm that there is a high power that rules in the affairs of men." Again, Ezra Taft Benson, and this is from his book, The Constitution, a Heavenly Banner. And he spoke, this was a common theme for him at some general conferences and other speeches. "Before the gospel could shine forth its resplendent light, religious and political freedom first had to be restored by God's power. By God's power, the Constitution was born, which guaranteed religious and political liberty." And then President Samuelson in 2007 asked the BYU student body to study the Constitution and seriously consider it as a course of work. You may be familiar with this story, but Wilford Woodruff, he talked about the founding fathers, and he said, "These men who laid the foundation of this American government signed the Declaration of Independence were the best spirits that God of heaven could find on the face of the earth." And then he said, "Every one of these men, with General Washington, called upon me as an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ in the temple at St. George 2 consecutive nights and demanded at my hands that I should go forth and attend to the ordinances of the house of God for them." Okay, and then finally, President Oaks, the Constitution was divinely inspired. And I'll just note the difference in the title between his 1992 talk and his 2001 talk. So in 1992, he called it the divinely inspired Constitution. He amped it up a little bit in 2021. He said, defending the divinely inspired Constitution. And at the beginning of that talk, he said, he called the times we live in troubled. So I think that increases the ante just a little bit. So let's talk about what actually makes this a miracle. We know it's inspired. We know it's a miracle. People, prophets, founders have said it. We just went through some of the most important quotes on it. But let's actually get down into it. Let's see what the convention is all about. So we're going to talk about the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and see what it's about. So first, we have to have a little background. So why do you need to call a convention in Philadelphia if you already have the Articles of Confederation? So the Articles of Confederation were really the first constitution of the United States. It had 13 sovereign and independent states. Each state had one vote. There were many disputes among these states. It was ratified March 1st, 1781. So it served as the Constitution for about 8 years. The problem is it didn't have any power. There was no single power to resolve issues. The country was in economic decline. There were disputes between the states over territory, war pensions, taxation, trade. There was no uniform front for the United States. So this concerned Washington and Madison. They felt the country was on the brink of collapse. And so they decided they were going to call a constitutional convention at Philadelphia. They said, we need a new government. So they had delegates from all the 13 colonies. The colonies were allowed to appoint as many delegates as they wanted, and they wanted them to come and form a new document, which is the Constitution. The pen is not working, so I want to show you. Okay. This is the Philadelphia Independence Hall, and it's really on the east side, which is right over here. I'm putting it in the middle. My pen function is not working, but it's the east side there where the assembly room is, where they signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. A very sacred space if you've ever been before. So just real quick stats about the Constitutional Convention. It was at the State House in Philadelphia. 55 delegates came. They were never there all at the same time. On average, you had 30 delegates attending. Rhode Island did not show up, so 12 of 13 states were represented. All the deliberations were secret. George Washington presided. Ben Franklin was the old sage, the oldest one, 81 years old. And it went for about 4 months. It started May 14th and ended September 17th, 1789. June 21st, 1788 was when all the states had, ratified the Constitution, and they took Sundays off. So let's look at this painting here again, and we can try to identify some of the different delegates. All right, so we'll go here first. I think that's obviously George Washington. We got that one down. Okay, we have down here at the table, I'm just going to put him on the middle of the screen. That is, who's that, you think? Yeah, that's James Madison. That's the scribe. So for every George Washington, you need a James Madison, right? You have to have a Nephi, you have to have a Sam, you have to have a Joseph and Oliver Cowdery. Yeah, you always have to have some support, and James Madison was it for George Washington. Okay, who do you think that one is in the center there? Ben Franklin. Okay, and who's whispering in his ear, do you think? Okay, but where's Jefferson? France. So that is Alexander Hamilton. All right. And then the last one I'm going to point out to you, we could go through all these, is the one right there. That is Governor Morris. And he's not as well known. They call him like the most unknown founder, but he's the penman of the Constitution. He is the one that drafted it, and he is one that drafted the words of the preamble. So he is the genius behind some of these wordings. So everything we know about all the drafting was from James Madison. So he was key, and his notes are really the only record all the delegates took some notes, but his were the most voluminous. And so it's thanks to him that we can understand a little bit about what went on in the proceedings. So that's why they call him the father. And how do I know all that? I use this cheat sheet. So you can find this online. The cheat sheet's available. So if you're really interested in counting all 40 delegates, have at it. All right. So let me just read a quote from President Ezra Taft Benson. Of the 40 signers, 21 were educated in leading American colleges and in Great Britain. 18 were or have been lawyers or judges. 26 have seen service in the Continental Congress. 19 served in the Revolutionary Army. 17 as officers. 4 had been on Washington's personal staff. One was the father of this country, another a vice president of the United States, a secretary of Treasury, a secretary of War, a secretary of State, 2 chief justices of the Supreme Court, and 3 who served as justices, and finally, Benjamin Franklin, the diplomat, philosopher, scientist, and statesman. So never had the world seen this type of collective knowledge. These were not farmers who just came out. These were men who were deeply studied in government and law and in just knowing how to put things together. I'm not sure how this one got in here. So I'll confess, I have friends in high places. So this is me on the streets of Philadelphia with some of my good friends, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. So if you want to get in touch with them, just let me know. We're very close. And that was in 2001. All right. So everyone went to Philadelphia in colonial Philadelphia. They were supposed to get there on May 14th, but only 2 states had delegates there on May 14th, Virginia and Pennsylvania. Obviously, Pennsylvania was easy, right? It's their home state. But no Rhode Island. So they actually didn't get a quorum until May 25th. That may have been a little bit discouraging to have 11 days of no quorum to really start your convention. You just see how this, it didn't start out as well as maybe they wanted it to. Oh, and so now we're going to go through some of the ideals of the founders. I want to give you a feel for what these men thought and believed at the time. And as you're thinking about these ideals that I'm going to tell you that the founders had, think about our ideals today and just compare, okay? So they wanted to become united as one nation. They had to bury their local interests and distinctions. That was the downfall of the Articles of Confederation. It was, I'm from Pennsylvania, not I'm from the United States. And so Patrick Henry said, no sooner were the state governments formed that their jealousy and ambition began to display themselves. Each endeavored to cut a slice from the common loaf to add to his morsel, till at length the Confederation became frittered down to impotent condition, and now it withstands. So that's what happened. Everyone was so individually interested that it just destroyed the Articles of Confederation. So John Dickinson of Delaware, and there's a law school named after him in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He said this at the convention, and it kind of resonated with all the delegates. He said, let our government be like that of a solar system. Let the general government be like the sun, and the states, the planets, repelled yet attracted, and the whole moving regularly and harmoniously in their several orbits. And the delegates really seized upon this. Dickinson also had another analogy. He said, 13 small streams pursuing one course. These analogies kind of went through the convention. Property was so important to the framers. They who have no property can have no freedom. To pursue happiness signified that a man could rise in the world according to his abilities and his industry. Property was a sacred and essential right. Equality in America. So in Europe, a member of the government would not ride in the same vehicle as a laborer or a member of the lower class. But in the United States, a congressman could be seated in a stagecoach with a laborer, and the two would be talking together. In America, equality of persons was not a matter of philosophers and poets, but it was accepted as an everyday fact. There were no strangers in America. They were all friends. Everyone had a fair chance. Farmers could be friends with legislatures. There was little poverty and no poor could be found. In America, there was an equality of birth and fortune. Middle-class workers. America was middle class. Americans worked for what they had. A Southern planter worked hard in the fields while a Northern merchant worked hard in business. America was not about fortune versus people of debt. Everyone was middle class and worked hard. The delegates really didn't discuss religion during the convention. They all knew what religion was. They knew the relationship between the church and the state. The state would not support one religion, but it would support religion in general. Delegates were profoundly influenced by their religious beliefs and training as well. The religion deism was accepted by the founders. Deists believe in God, but they found their belief through reason and not revelation. That was okay with the founders. In the end, the Constitution stated there was no religious test. So you did not have to affirm a belief in the Old Testament or the New Testament to hold public office. So anyone in America could believe anything. Hey, there was a significant prejudice against lawyers at the convention, even though that 30 plus of the delegates were lawyers. Maybe not the convention, maybe just America the whole. So lawyers were why was there this prejudice? Well, in England, lawyers required debtors to pay. They collected the debts. So it was just known, or people thought the lawyers threw honest people in prison. And so the revolutionaries believed that they could do better by themselves without involving the court. And I still believe that today. Don't involve the court in anything. If you can solve it yourself, you're going to save a lot of money. And that is why the Shakespeare had said, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. I mean, if you involve the lawyers, then it just gets pricey and it doesn't get resolved as quickly. All right, so May through June, things didn't go as well. People were proposing different plans. They couldn't decide on how many in the executive. Do you have 3 executives? Do you have 1 executive? What about the legislature? Is it bicameral, unicameral? They were debating all these things. Obviously, no one wanted a king. That was clear. They all agreed that they didn't want a tyrant. On June 18th, which may have been one of the lows of the convention, Alexander Hamilton gave a 6-hour speech. And both sides found it unacceptable to give a 6-hour speech. And it was hot in Philadelphia. If you've ever been in Philadelphia in the summer, it is hot. So one French visitor said this about Philadelphia: a veritable torture during Philadelphia's hot scene is the innumerable flies which are constantly light on the face and hands, stinging everywhere and everything black because of the filth they leave wherever they land. Rooms must be kept closed unless one wishes to be tormented in his bed at the break of day. And this need of keeping everything shut makes the heat of the night even more unbearable and sleep more difficult. And so the heat of the day makes one long for bedtime because of weariness, and a single fly, which has gained entrance in your room in spite of all precautions, drives you from your bed. So the heat was a real factor. And I'm from Philadelphia. It gets hot and humid. All right, so this is Edmund Jennings Randolph from Virginia. He's the one that proposed the Virginia Plan, which was really the basis of most of the Constitution. It had a legislature, a judiciary, an executive. It had 3 branches of government. He actually ultimately refused to sign the final document, unfortunately. But we can all redeem ourselves. And so when it went to ratification in Virginia, he argued in favor of the Constitution. He served on the Committee of Detail, which was the final committee where they actually just wrote down the Constitution on July 26th. So this is the Virginia Plan. We're not going to go into too much detail, but it had a number of different things to it. This is kind of the basis of the Constitution. There was a competing plan, the New Jersey Plan, and there was just a rub between those two the whole time. So it became it got to an impasse. On July 4th, in Philadelphia, there's this great parade going, and the delegates are hunkered in. In the parade, everybody's saying, hey, we're going to have a new government. This is so exciting. What a great future for our nation. And the delegates are saying, we haven't done anything. Like, we haven't agreed on anything. We better get moving. And so that was a really tough 4th of July to celebrate the independence of the country when you really haven't accomplished much. And so Washington, who's stoic, silent, humble, wrote to Alexander Hamilton, he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, who's in Paris, I almost despair of receiving a favorable issue to the proceedings of the convention and do therefore repent having any agency in this business. He was down. This was a tough time. And it went on July 5th, July 6th, July 7th, July 8th, July 9th. On July 10th, 2 delegates left the convention, said this is it, it's not going to work. So what's the answer? Well, while this was going on, it was still really hot. Close-fitting wigs and woolen coats, closed buttons, mosquitoes, bad water. Why are they staying there? How are they going to make this country come forth? Well, Roger Sherman from Connecticut gave him the answer. He had to raise it 3 times. So if you really feel passionate about something, maybe sometimes it might take a 3rd time to raise it, but he raised it 3 times. He said, here's the breakthrough. 2 houses of Congress, one, the House of Representatives, the other, the Senate. The Senate, equal representation, the House, representation by proportionality. That was the breakthrough. James Madison really did not want that, but he conceded. So these men had to compromise, and this plan ended up passing by 1 vote. 1 vote. How can we say our country passed by 1 vote? It was 1 vote. So there's other compromises that came. The 3/5 compromise, and I'm sure you've seen this a lot in the news. So we're going to talk about slaves a little bit, and I'm just going to give you some of the statements of some of the delegates. So what the compromise was, 5 slaves to 3 white free inhabitants for the census and for taxation purposes. The word slaves was entirely excluded from the Constitution. So those adamantly opposed to slavery agreed to this 3/5 compromise, and in return, those engaging in slavery agreed to stop the importation of slaves in 1808. So that was the agreement. Call it the federal ratio, the 3/5 compromise, whatever you want to say. Here's Alexander Hamilton said, without the federal ratio, no union could possibly have been formed. The Constitution could not have gone through without the slavery compromise. The question before the convention was not, shall slavery be abolished? Instead, it was, who shall have power to control it, the states or the national government? Congress could control the traffic in slaves exactly as it controlled others trade. Robert Sherman, slave trade was iniquitous, but he did not see himself as bound to make opposition. Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, he called slavery a nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. But he said the true question was whether the southern states shall or shall not be part of the Union. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, the question of slavery was for the states. He believed it for the states by making it, by ceasing the importation of slaves in 1808, it actually became a federal issue. So that was a win for those who wanted to abolish slavery. So Governor Mason of Virginia owned 200 slaves, and he said he would have freed his slaves if it had been possible, but the British government would not let him. John Lane of New Hampshire, he could not in good conscience leave to the states the slave trade, so it came to the national government. So what's our conclusion on this? This is a tough issue, let's be honest. But these delegates felt they could not form this country if they did not compromise on that issue. And we know what happened on this issue. This is the Battle of Gettysburg, Pickett's charge. So it took a civil war to solve the issue. And I can speculate a little bit. I'm not an expert, but I'll just give my speculation. I don't know if they would have said we're going to abolish slavery back at the time of the convention. Would the country have held together? I don't know. All right, so convention, they make these compromises. The convention adjourns for a few days to let the committee on detail draft the Constitution. So they had all these resolutions in place. The committee on detail got together. And now we're in September, and the members, they've got the new Constitution. They're all sitting there. Pennsylvania legislature is actually coming back in session on September 5th. So what are the delegates going to do? Well, the Pennsylvania legislature graciously agreed to go upstairs and let the delegates finish their deliberations. So if you look here, our delegates are upstairs, and the Pennsylvania Assembly is upstairs and the delegates are downstairs. Anyway, so just a little about George Washington during the debates. He was humble, often called on God for help, only spoke for 10 minutes at a time, just on the main points. In his strength lay his silence made him strong, or in his silence lay his strength. He was definitely a key part, obviously, of this whole convention. Same with Benjamin Franklin. And just to talk about, I try to move a little quicker because we only have about 8 minutes left. But just to talk about this spirit behind the convention, it was truly a spirit of compromise. And you know what? This is Catherine Drinker Bowen. She wrote the book A Miracle of Philadelphia, great book. But she said, no one feels good with a compromise. She calls it the devil, signifying a pact with the devil. You have to put aside your pride. You have to admit your error. But these men that came together were willing to compromise and admit their errors. So it came down to Saturday, September 15th. That was the final working day. Sunday there was no meeting. Monday, September 17th. Ben Franklin started out the day, and he said, "I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I'm not sure I'll ever approve. In these sentiments, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such." And he was trying to deflate the other side, those who may oppose the Constitution with that rhetoric. So they're about to do the final vote, and then Nathan Gorham says, if it's not too late, I'd like to suggest a change. You're like, oh no, sit down, sir. He said he would like to make the representation in Congress be based on instead of every 40,000 inhabitants, change it to every 30,000. This was so hotly contested. This had been hashed out over and over again. For him to raise this on the last day, who do you think is the only one that could resolve this? Washington. So Washington stood up, which is unusual for him, right? And everyone's a little surprised when Washington sits up. He stood up and supported it. And that was it. No one was going to contradict Washington. So he stepped in and used his authority at the right times. He did not abuse it. So here they all lined up about 3:00. They started signing it. They arranged themselves according to their states. And now we have a constitution. And this is the chair that was on the back of Washington. Sorry, this is the symbol on the back of Washington's chair. And as the last members were signing it, Ben Franklin said, looking at the chair, he had often asked himself, is this a setting sun or a rising sun? And he said, yes, This is a rising sun of our nation. So they signed it, and we're going to move really quick through it. It was ratified, and here is our Constitution right now. It's only 5 pages. It's only 4,543 words. And look how big "we the people" is. Wow, what a statement. It's got to be 10 times or 5 times bigger than any other thing. So this is the Constitution. Here's all the delegates and their signatures. You can go through and look at them. The most delegates were from Pennsylvania, then Virginia, and many others, but just an incredible document. And I've litigated cases where we submit briefs to a judge, and I've submitted briefs that are 10,000 and 15,000 words. And one time a judge came back, and I wasn't the head person on the brief. There's other people that, languish on more than I do, but the judge came back and said, this thing's 15,000 words. They wrote the Constitution in 4,000. What are you attorneys doing? So here's Federal Hall. This is where the first 10 amendments were passed. And one thing that President Benson said in one of his talks, the first day that the first Congress was in session with both houses was April 6th, 1789. Interesting. All right, so I'm going to just preview a little bit our next lectures. So J. Reuben Clark talked about 3 great fundamentals of the Constitution. We'll talk about those actually on Thursday: separation of powers, freedom of speech, press and religion, equality before the law. And then President Oaks also gave us principles that we're going to talk about. He had 5. And he said, but he was careful in his phrasing. He said there's at least 5. So he had people are the source of power, division of power, division of power vertically. So that's called federalism. And then separation of powers horizontally, written Bill of Rights, and the purpose of the Constitution. So those were his 5. And I've added my 2, which are not nearly as authoritative, but I have 2 others to propose to you. And we'll talk about those on Thursday. And then one other point, and this we'll also get into this on Thursday, was the U.S. Constitution for the United States only? These constitutional principles were for the world. In that same D&C section, God said it should be that the Constitution should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh, everyone in the world. So we're going to talk about these and then President Oaks said that in his talk in April 2021. It is a common heritage of constitutions around the world. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at President Oaks' principles, and we're going to see how other countries are applying those principles and see how they're affecting other countries, not just our own. So that's going to be Thursday. And then tomorrow, which is Wednesday, we're going to talk about the Pennsylvania Constitution and Joseph Smith. And I don't know if you knew this, but President Nelson, before he became prophet, he dedicated the Restoration site in Harmony, Pennsylvania. And he said in that talk that Pennsylvania was this sacred, this secure enclave, this protective place for Joseph Smith to accomplish his mission. So we're going to talk about why Pennsylvania served that role. And I'm from Pennsylvania, so I have a really heavy bias toward Pennsylvania. So if you just understand that going in, it'll make it easier. But we'll answer these questions tomorrow. Of the 220 lawsuits that Joseph Smith was involved in his lifetime, how many were in Pennsylvania versus Ohio, Missouri, New York, and Illinois? Second question we're going to talk about. We assume Joseph Smith had possession of the gold plates for 22 months. The gold plates actually in his custody. How many of those months was he in Pennsylvania? So we'll talk about this tomorrow, and thank you very much.